Good afternoon, Martin Haese, CEO of Business SA.
Antonio, buongiorno.
Buongiorno, cool. Thank you very much for taking this call. I know you're pressed for time today, and we've got some important meetings happening. So let's get straight into it. It's been a while now. You did the last survey of business confidence back in December. Now, in fact, you gave us a bit of highlights in the last time we chatted. But I want to feed on to that, and eventually we'll go to talk about what the outlook is from now on, given that in March this JobKeeper is going to close down. So what was the story the last time you did the survey of business confidence in South Australia?
Antonio, Business SA, as the Chamber of Commerce here in South Australia, has been doing quarterly surveys to the business community. So this is a business-to-business survey whereby business owners and business operators are answering the questions. We have been doing this every 3 months for quite literally 40 years. So it's statistically a very strong survey. It's the largest survey of its type in South Australia. A few weeks ago now, we concluded the results of our December quarter survey, which showed quite a strong lift in business confidence, which I must say was a very pleasant surprise for us here at Business SA, because that December quarter included the November lockdown, which of course during that time disrupted confidence in many ways. So we're actually on the cusp quite soon of going out to market, so to speak, and asking the questions about the March quarter survey, which we'll do in the next couple of weeks. So the survey results for December were actually 108 points, which statistically was actually quite a strong result and was above the 10-year moving average.
Yes, that is very strong statistically, and the fact that you have a very long history is very important. Last year, however, was a very difficult year, so it might throw things a bit out of kilter. I was reading in particular the comments about JobSeeker. They seem to be very important. It was unevenly used across sectors, and in fact it was used mostly or very highly in the tourism sector, which is a topic of conversation right now with initiatives. What are you seeing there?
Well, what we saw in the December surveying, because we also asked the question, how many employers still have their employees on JobKeeper? And the answer was about 30%. So quite a large sample group of businesses that responded to the survey. So 30% said they're still on JobKeeper as at the end of December last year. That means that number will remain the same, of course, probably through to 28th of March. And that's what we expect. We don't expect that number to have materially changed between December quarter and March quarter, because we also asked, do you project that your business will stay on JobKeeper for the last 3 months, which will be January, February and March? The vast majority said yes. So what that means, of course, at the end of March, 28th of March, which is looming very soon, is that there will be no more stimulus. JobKeeper will formally finish. And the sectors which are most impacted by that are, of course, the hospitality sector, or certainly parts thereof, the tourism sector, parts of the accommodation sectors, those businesses that are involved in major events, those businesses that have any reliance on international tourists, whether they're leisure tourists or conference attendees, especially in the city. A lot of people come into Adelaide for conferences. They clearly have not been happening. So there is still a reasonably large cohort of employers and thus their employees who have been reliant on JobKeeper. So the $1 million question, Antonio, will be, what will life look like after the end of JobKeeper?
Well, in fact, that was a comment that your colleague in Victoria, Paul Guerra, made when I had an interview with him earlier this year, and late last year. He was more concerned around the February-March time, and he was concerned about the debt overhang that might occur. Now, we hear that it's going to finish, the JobSeeker. There have, however, been some initiatives targeting the tourism sector. Is that enough, in your opinion?
It's a good question. So the federal government, many would recall, very recently have announced that they are subsidising the cost of air flights to a number of destinations around Australia, of which Adelaide City is actually one of them. But that will help some, but that certainly won't help all. So what they've done, it was a very targeted federal stimulus program designed to support those regions which are most impacted. And because Adelaide is a gateway through to Kangaroo Island, Adelaide was included with Kangaroo Island. Now, that'll be good for Adelaide hotels and Adelaide cafes and restaurants and Adelaide taxi drivers and Uber drivers and many others. But of course, that won't help everybody. There are many parts around the city and metropolitan Adelaide and even parts of regional South Australia which have still have a higher dependency on international tourists other than domestic, and they still might be impacted as we move forward.
Yes, well, we might come back to that. It opens up the question, a broader question of the role of government in maintaining the economy on par. But along the way, if we do have some time later on, we have spoken in the past about your interest, or that of business, say, in maybe developing motorsports or the motorsports sector in South Australia. The government first said they weren't going to support the Clipsa 500, or what it's called. And now I think in recent days I've seen that e-motorsports is off the agenda.
Yes, very topical, Antonio. So many of your listeners would know that South Australia has a very long history in motorsport, starting back from pre-1985, but most notably 1985 when the Adelaide Grand Prix started. That went for 10 years through to 1995. We had a Le Mans event briefly in South Australia. Then we had the Clipsal and various iterations of it, generally known as the Adelaide 500. Now, the Adelaide 500 is not continuing in South Australia, and that's disappointed many people, but that's not going ahead for various reasons. So the question is, after many years of having a major motorsport fixture on the South Australian events calendar, the state runs the risk of having nothing, or nothing of magnitude. So that could be many things. Now, Business SA in the past has been advocating for a FormulaE, which effectively is the electric version of Formula One. It's a category of motorsport which is growing globally, and it sits comfortably along with South Australia's renewable energy leadership. You're absolutely correct. Although I don't think it's been supported by a formal announcement, but it's certainly been intimated very strongly that FormulaE in South Australia is highly unlikely. But if that is unlikely, the question is, what do we need to do? There are other events. There, of course, was another wonderful event in South Australia called the Adelaide Motorsport Festival, which is combined with a part of that event called the Adelaide Rally. There is the facility at the Bend. There are literally over 140 car clubs and motoring clubs around South Australia who do lots of their own local events, but they're not really in the major event category. We need something which brings people into South Australia, into Adelaide, from preferably around Australia and even beyond. And that takes a major event to do that.
Major event. And I'm hearing again today, I'm seeing today is plans for another stadium, maybe was it a replacement for the entertainment centre along the River Torrens? Yes,
that was announced in the media today by the Premier. So from what I understand, the desired location, at least, is the piece of land which sits immediately west of the Morford Street Bridge, adjoining the railway tracks and adjoining the River Torrens. There's a strip of parklands there, but behind the two university buildings, the University of Adelaide and the UniSA buildings there on North Terrace, which front onto North Terrace. And there is a proposal to actually build a facility right across the railway tracks. That, once you take the railway track area into consideration, is actually quite a large area. And that would be a multi-use sport facility for court sports, certainly basketball and possibly tennis and certainly concerts. So, that may have some real merit.
Yes, okay, so we'll have to digest what that means. But as you said, I think you're going to market in the next couple of weeks with the next survey, so maybe the business will already start to have seen the effect of the end of job seeker. So maybe I'll just ask you to speculate or see what you're thinking about the outlook beyond Mad March, and maybe think about the role of government in sustaining the economy, because what we've seen in the last year and a bit is not what would have been expected of centre-right governments in Australia in recent years. Does Business SA have any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's 2020 posed interesting times, practically, financially, and politically, because the behaviour by many right and centre-right governments, possibly in many jurisdictions around the world, was not entirely emblematic of how they always behave. There was a lot of stimulus spending. There's a lot more debt. Many would argue, and look, Business SA, I must say, Antonio was also an advocate for it. What were the choices? In absence of the stimulus, the impact could have been catastrophic. And not only on business owners and those that have taken a risk to build a business over the years, but equally so on their literally tens of thousands of employees. And you might recall early 2020 when there was some kind of early forecasts in terms of what could happen to unemployment in South Australia. And that number, of course, was, I think on its way towards 20% at one point in time. Now, look, thankfully, we never got anywhere near that. But in many ways, in terms of debt, we'll pay a price for it. But I think it's a price that many have accepted. If we look past the 28th of March, when the vast majority of stimulus is wound up, is the economy structurally strong enough to self-sustain? I mean, that's the question of the day. And the building industry is doing well. The housing industry is doing well. Property prices are clearly strong. The retail stores, the hospitality industry is doing reasonably well. It's really this 15% of the economy who have a dependency on tourism and major events and things like that, who are impacted. The argument is that post 28th of March, when the stimulus winds up, is that the likelihood is that they will in all probability remain impacted because the national borders will still be closed. A lot of people are suggesting that the economy is actually structurally strong enough to basically rebound and self-sustain into a post-stimulus environment. It may well be the case. And if it is the case, Antonio, if we do continue with the strength in the economy that we have now, and that continues into April, May and June, the last quarter of the financial year, you could almost argue the next financial year, actually, you could be quite positive about. It could be very strong. So the alternative is we take a dip. And the question then will be, how deep is that dip?
Yes, indeed. We will probably return to pre-COVID levels of activity and growth, which is very nice. There have been for several years, however, calls, especially even from the central banks. The central bankers are not very dovish like this, for deep investment in infrastructure by governments. But now I'm aware that you have to go. If you have a quick comment to make about the need for ongoing investment in infrastructure to support long-term growth for the economy, and then I'll be again very, very grateful for your time and how we've managed to work out this situation today.
Thank you, Antonio. Well, look, Business SA is a believer that whether it's built infrastructure, whether it's digital infrastructure, that it's very, very important for the prosperity of South Australia. Whether it's stimulating population growth in regional and rural communities around South Australia, roads and duplication of highways actually have a lot to do with that. Freight corridors have a lot to do with that. shipping for export has a lot to do with that. The commonality of all of this is it's infrastructure related. So Business SA has a long-held view that infrastructure is right within the wheelhouse of the state government of South Australia and the federal government. It's one key role that a government must play in order to stimulate economic activity, in order to create the conditions where it's good to do business, people will take a risk, people will invest, people will grow, and people will employ. So we are big advocates for infrastructure spending on governments. As long as the projects are right, we do work very closely with Treasury here in South Australia, with Treasurer Rob Lucas and his team. And generally, we find them to be very consultative when it comes to the discussions we have together about what infrastructure is needed to propel South Australia forward. So I think the state government recognise that. Our job is to maintain that focus so that it doesn't slip off the agenda. Infrastructure is important because it enables growth. There's no doubt about it.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for this multimedia interview, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in 3 months' time.
Thank you, Antonio. Nice talking to you and nice talking to your listeners. Thank you. Bye-bye.